Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the break room when she wasn't there. Just a nurse who kept to herself, ate lunch alone, and never spoke about her past. Danielle Ross had worked the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston for 3 years without incident, which meant she was invisible. Invisible was safer. Invisible meant no questions. Invisible meant the patch sewn into her jacket lining, faded canvas reading MARSOC CST, Marja 2004, stayed exactly where it belonged. Hidden. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the constancy of a machine gun in the distance. Danielle moved through the 2 a.m. shift with mechanical precision, her hand steady on 4 lines despite a tremor that appeared only when she was still. Her knuckles were scarred in a pattern most people didn't recognize, the distinctive shape of rifle recoil burns from a Mk16 carbine fired 47,000 times over 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A silver star she'd never mentioned. The scars were covered by her sleeves whenever possible, and when they showed, she adjusted her cuff without thinking. Muscle memory. Everything was muscle memory now. The other nurses had stopped trying to include her months ago. They gathered in the staff locker room around 1 a.m., their voices bright with gossip and weekend plans, and when Danielle entered, the room didn't go silent exactly, nothing that obvious, but it became a different kind of quiet. The kind that meant her presence was being tolerated, not welcomed. She never used the locker room to change. She arrived in scrubs under her jacket, the military-issue Carhartt she wore every shift regardless of season. When she hung it in her assigned locker, her fingers performed the same ritual each night, a brush against the patch inside the lining. Not a check. Just a touch. An anchor. The lining was threadbare from 20 years of that same small gesture. Danielle worked the northern ICU corridor, beds for through 12, moving from monitor to monitor with the kind of efficiency that came from not wasting a single motion. She checked central lines. Drew labs. Adjusted ventilator settings. She spoke to patients even when they couldn't hear her, her voice steady and low, her tone the same whether they were conscious or sedated. Some of the older nurses said she was wasting her time talking to people in comas. Danielle never responded. She simply continued speaking, her hand resting on the patient's shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, enough time for the human nervous system to register comfort, not long enough to seem unprofessional. She'd learned that timing in a field hospital in Sanjan Valley, holding the hand of a 18-year-old lance corporal whose femoral artery was hemorrhaging while his squad leader screamed for a chopper that was still 8 minutes out. That corporal had lived. His name was Mitchell. He was a manager at a Target now in Tucson. She'd checked his Facebook once, 3 years ago. The night's rhythm was broken at 1:38 a.m. by the sound of orderlies wheeling a stretcher down the corridor. The ventilator hissed. The monitor beeped. The radio crackled with vital signs, male, 28, Army Ranger, admitted from the VA with severe PTSD, no family contact, listed as John Doe pending identification. The orderlies moved with the casual efficiency of people transporting another body through another night in another hospital. Danielle didn't look up from the monitor she was standing at. Not until they passed. Not until she saw the face. Her clipboard clattered to the floor. The sound was loud enough in the quiet ICU to make one of the nurses in the adjacent bay turn around. Danielle didn't move. She was frozen mid-step, her hand still extended where the clipboard had been, her eyes tracking the stretcher as it disappeared into bed 6. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed. A cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm from another patient, alive, stable, unremarkable. She picked up the clipboard. Her hands moved through the motion. Muscle memory. Everything was muscle memory. The ranger in bed 6 was catatonic. That was the word they used in the report, catatonic. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the drop-ceiling tiles. His hands lay at his sides, palms down on the thin hospital blanket, and even from 3 feet away, Danielle could see the tremor. Not a shake. A tremor like an engine running at idle, constant and involuntary and controlled by some part of the nervous system that had decided the war wasn't over. The soldier's uniform hung on the corner of the bed in a plastic bag. No boots visible. No medals. Nothing that marked him as anything other than another John Doe with PTSD and a system that had decided he wasn't worth identifying. When they tried to get him to take medication at 3 a.m., he clamped his jaw shut and turned his face away. "Come on, buddy," the CNA said, holding out a paper cup with 2 tablets and a small cup of water. "Just gonna help with the anxiety, okay?" Doc's orders. The ranger didn't respond. Didn't move. His tremor continued its mechanical rhythm. The CNA sighed and moved on to the next patient. He'd be back in an hour to try again. That was the protocol for non-compliant patients with PTSD. Gentle coaxing. Low pressure. Space for autonomy. It rarely worked. Danielle waited until the CNA was out of earshot. Then she did something that made a veteran night nurse glance up from her computer screen with surprise. She pulled a chair closer to the ranger's bed and sat down. She didn't speak. She simply sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the monitor behind her, casting her shadow across his chest. Her hands folded in her lap. Her breathing steady and deep, the kind of breathing that came from having spent 1,000 nights in places where sound meant death. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The monitor beeped. The ventilator wheezed. The ranger's eyes didn't move. On the 12th minute, Danielle reached for the medication cup on the bedside table. She didn't offer it to him. She simply held it in her palm, letting him see it in his peripheral vision, letting him know it was there without pressure. Without demand. The 2 tablets were visible through the clear plastic of the cup. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She existed in a space beside him like someone who understood that some soldiers didn't respond to words. Some soldiers responded to presence. Some soldiers needed to know they weren't alone without anyone telling them so. On the 17th minute, the ranger's eyes shifted. Just a fraction. Just enough to register that he'd seen her sitting there. Danielle didn't acknowledge it. She picked up his hand, the left one, the one without the fall line, and placed the medication cup into his palm. Then she guided his hand toward his mouth, her movement slow and deliberate, the way someone would move if they were handling something infinitely fragile. His tremor made the cup shake. The water sloshed. One of the tablets fell onto the blanket. She retrieved it. Returned it to the cup. Waited. He swallowed the medications. The water. His hand dropped back to the bed, and she let it go slowly, maintaining contact for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for his nervous system to register that this touch wasn't a threat. That this touch meant something. When she stood to leave, his eyes tracked her movement. Just barely. Just enough. She returned to her station and made a note on his chart. Patient compliant with medications after nonverbal communication technique. Vital stable. Recommend continued minimal intervention approach. That was when Dr. Hargrove arrived for his 4 a.m. rounds. He moved through the ICU the way a man moves through a space he owns, silk tie already loosened, Italian shoes clicking on the tile floor with a rhythm that was almost musical. His phone was in his right hand, his other hand scrolling through his own chart on a tablet, his eyes not rising to acknowledge the nurse who'd been sitting with the new admission. Hargrove was 56 and had built his career on military consulting contracts and board connections, which meant he understood the language of soldiers without ever having been one. He understood the currency of their problems, PTSD, TBI, moral injury, the kind of damage that didn't show on a scan. He understood it the way an accountant understands money. Intellectually. Clinically. Without the necessity of actual compassion. His eyes flicked toward bed 6 as he passed. He paused. He stood there for 3 seconds, tablet in hand, his gaze moving from the ranger to Danielle, who was now standing at her computer, her hands busy with charting, her face angled away from him. She could feel his attention the way a soldier feels a sniper scope, that particular weight that comes from being measured and found insufficient. Then he turned to the day shift nurse who was giving him report. "The John Doe," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of institutional authority that came from controlling someone else's paycheck. "What's his status?" "Catatonic on admission." "Nonverbal." "Severe PTSD." "We got him on anxiolytics about 20 minutes ago." "How?" The day nurse gestured vaguely. "The night nurse. She sat with him. He took them without incident." Hargrove's eyes moved back to Danielle. She was still charting. Still not looking at him. Her hands moved across the keyboard with precision, her posture absolutely still, the kind of stillness that came from military bearing but looked like fear to someone who didn't know the difference. He made a mental note, the kind that didn't go in charts but traveled through the informal networks of hospital politics. Unnecessary emotional labor. Boundary violations. Inappropriate attachment to patients. The kind of inefficiency that, if left unchecked, could compromise the clinical model he'd spent 15 years building at Oak Creek Memorial. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Just not spoken yet. Danielle's knuckles were white against the keyboard, the scars on her hands shaped like rifle recoil burns, shaped like 1,000 things she'd never be asked about. Morning came slow at Oak Creek Memorial. The kind of morning where fluorescent lights cast everything in the shade of surrender. Danielle had worked through the night, stayed 2 hours past shift end without clocking it, because the ranger's monitor showed irregular rhythms and someone needed to sit with him. She didn't expect gratitude. She didn't expect anything. She expected exactly what she'd learned, that broken people sometimes needed silence more than they needed words. At 7:22 a.m., a woman with the same dark eyes as the ranger appeared in the doorway. His sister. She wore a navy dress uniform with ribbons that meant she'd served, that she understood. Her jaw was tight, the kind of tight that came from 2 years of watching someone you loved disappear into themselves. She held a photograph in her hands, a boy maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a schoolhouse with blue gates. Kandahar. 2 decades compressed into a 4x6 print. "Any change?" the sister asked. Her voice was steady, military-trained. Professional. The kind of voice that breaks in private. Danielle looked up from the chart. He took his medication without resistance this morning. Physically stable. Vitals holding. But nothing else. Not a question. Not yet. Danielle had learned years ago that hope was a liability and honesty was a mercy. She'd learned that in places that didn't appear on maps, where people bled out in dust and you held pressure on wounds while helicopters circled and you told yourself that surviving meant something. Sometimes it takes time. The sister sat down beside the ranger's bed. She didn't touch him. Just looked at his face, the scar tissue above his left eye, the way his hands lay flat against the blanket like he was bracing for impact that never came. She left the photograph on the nightstand where he could see it when he woke. Danielle's shift was ending at 8 a.m. She should have left. Protocol said she should have given report to the day nurse and walked out into the Houston heat and stopped thinking about a boy who'd been 8 years old in a collapsed schoolhouse and was now a man who couldn't speak. But his sister was still there, still looking at him like she was trying to see the person underneath the silence, and Danielle understood that particular kind of desperation. She'd learned it in the field. She'd learned that some vigils couldn't be kept alone. So she sat at the bedside during what should have been her break. 20 minutes. She didn't speak. Just let her presence settle like a weight that wasn't crushing. The ranger's breathing slowed. His hand, which had been clenched all night, relaxed against the sheet. When Danielle picked up the medication cup with his 9 a.m. pills, he took them without the tremor that usually accompanied the swallowing. His sister watched in silence. The door opened at 8:23 a.m. like something violent. Dr. Hargrove didn't announce himself. He simply appeared in the frame, tall, built like a man who spent his mornings at the gym instead of with patients, wearing a white coat that had probably never been wrinkled by actual work. His presence was the kind that tried to fill the room, tried to make everyone smaller. His tie was Hermes, probably cost more than Danielle made in a week. His shoes gleamed like mirrors. Nurse Ross. A word. Now. He didn't lower his voice. The command wasn't a request. It was something that expected obedience the way gravity expected objects to fall. Danielle stood. The sister's jaw tightened. She understood authority. She recognized its texture. Hargrove stepped into the hallway, and Danielle followed, already knowing what was coming. She'd worked in hospitals long enough to read the signs. The way his eyes had catalogued her presence at the bedside. The calculation behind his teeth. "What you're doing here is inappropriate," he said. His voice was pitched low enough that the sister couldn't hear, which made it worse somehow. Privacy made cruelty feel intentional. This patient is receiving medication. He's receiving meals. He's receiving vital sign monitoring. What he doesn't need is a nurse playing therapist, playing hero, playing surrogate emotional support. Hargrove's eyes moved over her like she was a problem his mind was solving. "You're a nurse. Not a psychologist. Not a friend. When you cross that line, when you exceed your scope of practice, you create liability. You create risk. You create exactly the kind of incident that ends careers." Danielle took one measured breath through her nose. In operations, they taught you that your face was a weapon. Control it, and you controlled the room. Let it slip, and you were finished. So she kept her expression level. Kept her hand steady. Kept her voice flat. He needed extra time with medication administration. I gave him time. That's exactly the kind of insubordination I'm documenting, Hargrove said. And one tear, just one, escaped down her cheek before she could stop it. Not from sadness. From something harder. From the kind of restraint that builds pressure behind your eyes until your body has to release it somewhere. She wiped it away without looking at him. Without breaking eye contact. Without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Hargrove's jaw tightened. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. The moment when a predator realizes the thing it's stalking isn't quite as helpless as it looks. But he recovered quickly, the way men with power always do. Effective immediately, I'm placing a formal notation in your file regarding boundary violations and clinical efficiency protocol breach, he said. There will be an audit of your time cards for the past 3 months. I suggest you get your documentation in order. He left. Just turned and walked down the corridor with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Danielle stood in the hallway for 30 seconds, feeling her pulse slow, feeling the military part of her brain come online like old machinery starting up. That part didn't panic. That part didn't cry. That part had faced worse things than a doctor with an expensive suit and an inferiority complex wrapped up in medical credentials. But the present tense of her life was a night shift nurse at a hospital in Houston, not a senior chief petty officer on a classified operation, and she couldn't let anyone see that line blur. By 12:44 p.m., when Danielle returned for the afternoon shift, the break room was occupied. 8 nurses and 2 residents scattered across tables. The microwave hummed. The refrigerator clicked on and off like it was breathing. Everything was normal until she sat down with her sandwich, and then everything stopped being normal. One by one, they gathered their lunches. Eyes never met hers. Conversations died mid-sentence. Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for the sound of the vending machine cycling down and the fluorescent lights buzzing their thin, persistent hum. She sat alone under lights that cast everything in shades of white and grey. She didn't eat her sandwich. She sat there for 15 minutes and felt the room's emptiness like something with weight. The notice went up in the staff hallway at 1:15 p.m. She didn't see who posted it. Didn't need to. The handwriting was official. The formatting was clinical. The destruction was comprehensive. Boundary violation notice, clinical efficiency protocol breach. Staff member, D. Ross, RN. Date of incident, the 14th of March, 2024. Details, extended patient contact exceeding medication administration parameters. Informal care protocols inconsistent with facility standards. Status, under review for timecard audit and employment fitness determination. Signed, Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Staff. She stared at it for 20 seconds. 30. Long enough that another nurse walked past and pretended not to see her standing there. Long enough that the words started to feel less like accusations and more like prophecy. Danielle had been erased once before, by the CIA, by official channels that decided her existence was a security risk. She'd spent 3 years rebuilding something like a life out of the rubble of that erasure. And now, watching her name on a bulletin board like a public indictment, she felt the erasure starting again. By 4 p.m., the staff meeting had been called. 23 nurses and residents in the conference room. The kind of meeting that felt like theater, everyone playing their part. Hargrove stood at the front with his laptop open, projecting something onto the wall screen. Her time cards. The last month of her employment, blown up large enough that everyone could read the numbers. "We have a consistency issue," he said. His voice was the kind of smooth that suggested he'd practiced this. Nurse Ross logged 8.5 hours on Tuesday. Our badge scanning system shows 8.2 hours of physical presence. Either our security system is malfunctioning, or we have someone in this room who believes hospital time is equivalent to personal charity time. He paused. Let the silence settle. We have a nickname for nurses who can't follow simple documentation rules. We call them former nurses. Scattered laughter. The uncomfortable kind that people make when they're unsure if they're supposed to be amused or horrified. Danielle's hands were flat on the table. She'd sat in briefings where men with stars on their shoulders made worse accusations. She'd sat in interrogation rooms, on both sides of the table, and held her composure when her life hung on her ability to stay silent. So she stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then she spoke. "I have never stolen a single minute from anyone in my life." Her voice was level. Controlled. The voice of someone who meant what she said with the kind of certainty that comes from having done worse things than punch a time card wrong. The voice of someone who'd held lives together with her hands and asked nothing for it except the permission to keep working. Hargrove smiled. That was the worst part. He smiled like she'd proven something he'd already suspected. "Then you won't mind the external audit I've already requested. We'll be bringing in a third-party investigator tomorrow morning. I'm confident this will all be resolved to everyone's satisfaction." The meeting ended. People gathered their folders. Danielle stayed in her seat while the room entered around her. She could feel the calculation happening in every mind that passed her on the way out. She could feel the narrative settling into place. Unstable. Difficult. Possibly dishonest. The kind of nurse that good hospitals eventually don't have around anymore. She walked to her car at 4:48 p.m. The Houston heat was the kind that pressed down like a physical thing. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks. She sat in her vehicle with the windows down, hands on the steering wheel, and didn't start the engine. Instead, she pulled her jacket open just enough to see the edge of the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining. MARSOC CST, Marja 2004. The combat support team that had gone into a collapsed schoolhouse when everyone else was standing back, waiting for clearance, waiting for authorization. The team that had pulled out a boy with dust in his hair and terror in his eyes. She knew who he was. She'd known the moment she walked into his room. That couldn't happen. That wasn't supposed to be possible. But it had happened anyway, and now she was being dismantled by a man in an expensive suit who had no idea that the person he was destroying had spent the last 20 years carrying a child he'd pulled from rubble. What happened next didn't just end her shift. It changed the direction of everything coming. But first, there was the night to get through. First, there was darkness, and silence, and a mute ranger in an ICU bed who held the answers to questions nobody was asking. True class is what you do when the lights go out. At 6:33 a.m., before the first residents arrived for rounds, Dr. Hargrove sat in a hospital administrator's office with his phone pressed to his ear, yacht club ambient noise crackling in the background, ice clinking in expensive glasses, the muted thud of a tennis ball on a distant court. The chairman of the hospital board, Marcus Ashford, was mid-breakfast on his 42-foot sailboat anchored off Galveston Bay. Hargrove had timed the call perfectly. Men like Ashford made their most consequential decisions before 9 in the morning, when their defenses were still lowered by the illusion of leisure. Marcus, I wouldn't reach out unless the situation required board-level awareness, Hargrove began, his voice calibrated to convey both concern and reluctance. We have a nurse on the ICU night rotation, 3 years here, no prior employment history on file, exhibiting boundary violations that cross into clinical incompetence. She spent 43 minutes yesterday attempting to manually coax a catatonic patient into medication compliance instead of following protocol for pharmacological intervention. In front of the patient's family. Undermining physician authority. The silence on the other end was exactly what Hargrove expected. Ashford understood the language of institutional liability. The family is now emotionally invested in this nurse's care approach. When we make the medically sound decisions that override her methods, we'll face resistance. Potential complaint. You know how these escalate. Hargrove's tone remained conversational, as if discussing weather patterns. I'm implementing immediate corrective measures, but I wanted the board to understand the context before any complaints surface. What are you seeing? Ashford asked, his voice stripped of its leisure day warmth. Possible prior military background. Her clinical instincts are tactical rather than evidence-based. She moved that patient's for during rounds yesterday with the precision of someone trained in field triage, not hospital protocol. When I questioned it, she had no explanation. Just deferred to my authority and accepted the correction. Hargrove paused. Let that sink in. A nurse who defers too easily after demonstrating uncommon competence. A pattern of hidden knowledge. I'm having HR pull her full file and contact her VA references. There's a gap in her documented history that's worth understanding. By 10:15 a.m., Hargrove had the VA personnel office on a three-way call with HR Director Linda Chen. The voice on the other end, a retired Navy administrator named Patterson, was careful, measured. Her employment record with us shows 3 years of contract nursing, ending 6 months ago, Patterson said. Before that, there's nothing. No prior service designation, no clearance history, no prior employment cross-reference in our system. Hargrove felt the satisfaction of a man watching a puzzle piece click into place. So she came to the VA with an incomplete background. No prior work history documented. That's correct, Patterson confirmed. Which is unusual. Most nurses we hire have a documented career trajectory. Hers begins in media res. 3 years of exemplary performance reviews, then she transitioned to Oak Creek. And there's no explanation for the gap? No military service record? Hargrove pressed. Patterson's pause lasted just long enough to confirm that he was choosing his words carefully. Our records show employment history only. Prior service, if any, would be documented through a separate vetting process. After the call ended, Hargrove sat in the silence of his office and smiled. A nurse with tactical medical knowledge, no documented prior employment, no military record on file, and the kind of composure under pressure that belonged to people trained by institutions that didn't advertise themselves. Whether she'd been military or something else didn't matter. What mattered was that she was operating outside the normal parameters of hospital life, and she had no institutional protection for whatever she actually was. He drafted an email at 11:08 a.m. with the hospital's general counsel copying on the message. Subject line, External Competency Review, Personnel Concern. I am formally requesting an external clinical investigator to conduct a standard competency audit on ICU nursing staff, the email read. Specifically, I have concerns about one nurse who demonstrates advanced procedural knowledge inconsistent with her documented training history. This is a routine HR matter. I'm flagging it for due diligence. By 1:53 p.m., an external investigator named Dr. Raymond Pierce had arrived at Oak Creek. He was the type of man hospitals called when they needed someone to find what they'd already decided to look for: sleek, professional, armed with a clipboard, and the kind of certainty that came from believing every person was hiding something. Hargrove spent the next 90 minutes in a private conference room with Pierce, laying out the narrative with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Danielle's advanced tactical medical knowledge. Her unusual composure under stress. The suspicious gap in her employment history. The way she deferred to authority when questioned, which Hargrove now reframed as calculated compliance rather than genuine confusion. "I'm not suggesting impropriety," Hargrove said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm suggesting inconsistency. She possesses skills that typically require formal military or paramilitary training. Her documentation doesn't reflect that. In healthcare, credential verification is foundational. I want to understand where her skills came from." Pierce took notes in a kind of small, precise script that suggested a man who had never questioned whether his conclusions were justified. "I'll conduct individual interviews with ICU staff. Nursing supervisors. Get a sense of her interactions, her professional boundaries, any incidents that might indicate hidden agendas or undisclosed background." The interviews began at 2:45 p.m. Danielle was working pediatric patients on the second floor when security appeared at the entrance to the ward. A new badge had been programmed that morning. Her ICU access had been suspended effective immediately. The electronic lock at the ICU entrance would reject her card. She was reassigned, the memo had stated. Pediatric nursing. Effective immediately. Patient care continuity concerns. She'd read the memo 3 times that morning, each time feeling the familiar sensation of institutional machinery engaging around her. It was the way systems worked. First, isolation. Then erasure. Then the official narrative took root. Through the pediatric ward's observation windows, she could see the hallway monitor displaying vital signs from 3 ICU beds. The Rangers was 4th on the list, visible on the digital display mounted near the nursing station. She'd been watching it from across the hospital, through whatever gaps in geography the ward layout allowed. At 2:55 p.m., his heart rate was 106. His respiratory rate was 24. Both climbing. She approached one of the pediatric residents, Dr. Sarah Huang, early 30s, competent, still learning which battles to fight and which to surrender. The Army patient in ICU bed 4 is showing early signs of cardiac compromise. His vitals have been trending upward for the last 12 hours. Respiratory rate elevated, heart rate compensating. "I'm concerned about fluid accumulation." Sarah's face flickered through the calculation of professional risk. "Did you talk to the on-call resident?" "Twice." He said. Dr. Hargrove reviewed the case. Sarah's expression closed like a door. "Then the case has been reviewed." Danielle understood the message. Don't push. Don't escalate. Don't make yourself visible by being right about something Hargrove had already decided was fine. The institutional hierarchy had spoken. Professional courtesy meant accepting that decision. At 3:20 p.m., Dr. Pierce was interviewing night shift ICU nurses in a small conference room. He asked each of them the same questions, rotating through the phrasing like a man checking the same lock from multiple angles. How would you characterize Danielle Ross's clinical approach? Does she seem to work within standard protocols, or do you notice deviations? Has she ever mentioned prior military service? How would you describe her bedside manner with difficult patients? The answers were cautious. Danielle was professional, competent, quiet, kept to herself. Nobody had heard her discuss background or prior work. She was helpful without being social. One nurse, Marcus Holloway, 23 years on the unit, offered a single observation that Pierce didn't include in his official notes but certainly filed in the category of useful. She moves like someone who's comfortable with crisis, Holloway said. Not nervous. Not reactive. Just ready. Like she's been waiting for something to go wrong. At 4:15 p.m., Hargrove received a status update. Pierce's investigation was proceeding nominally. 5 interviews completed, 3 pending. The narrative was holding. Nobody knew anything specific, but the pattern of evasion was beginning to take shape. A nurse with uncommon skills and an incomplete past. A nurse who moved with the muscle memory of someone trained for situations most nurses never encountered. By 4:02 p.m., Danielle stood in the hallway of the second floor, pediatric ward, looking down at a text message from the ranger's sister, Maya. His monitor is showing something. They won't let me in to see him. Can you check on him? Please. The text had arrived at 4:43 p.m. She walked to the stairs. The stairwell smelled like industrial floor cleaner and the faint copper notes of old blood nobody had quite managed to scrub away. Her footsteps echoed, the sound of a single person ascending, alone, in a building where her presence was no longer authorized. The ICU access door loomed at the top of the second-floor landing. She raised her badge to the electronic sensor. The light blinked red. A security guard appeared from around the corner, a new hire, maybe 24, with the uncertain posture of someone enforcing rules he didn't fully understand. Dr. Hargrove's orders. You don't have clearance for this unit. Danielle didn't argue. She turned and walked back down the stairs. From the pediatric ward, through the observation window, she could still see the vital sign monitor. The ranger's heart rate was 112. His respiratory rate was 28. The numbers climbing in real time, each number a countdown, each number a fact stating what everyone in the hospital knew except the people making decisions. Cardiac tamponade doesn't wait for authorization. It doesn't care about institutional hierarchy. Beck's triad. Muffled heart sounds from fluid compressing the myocardium. Hypertension from the fluid restricting venous return. Distended jugular veins from the pressure building in the chest cavity. She'd seen it twice in Kandahar, once in a boy hit by shrapnel, once in a contractor with penetrating trauma. Both had required emergency pericardiocentesis. A needle into the pericardial sac. Fluid drainage. Immediate relief or immediate death. She paged the on-call resident at 5:02 p.m. Bedford is showing classic tamponade signs. Rising respiratory rate, tachycardia, hypertension on your last recording. I think he's developing fluid around the heart. The resident's response came 4 minutes later, thanks for the note. Dr. Hargrove evaluated this morning. Patient is stable. She paged again at 5:18 p.m. Respiratory rate is now 32. This is acute deterioration. No response. The heart monitor showed the numbers climbing like a fever. The ranger's body was screaming in the only language available to it, and the physicians had decided not to listen. Danielle stood in the pediatric ward at 5:16 p.m., watching a child with croup try to breathe, and made the calculation that every good soldier makes eventually. The moment when following orders means letting someone die, and breaking them might mean the same thing, but at least you tried. 2 in the morning, and the cardiac monitor screamed like a wounded animal. The high-pitched wail cut through the ICU's darkness, piercing through the hum of ventilators and the rhythmic beeping of 100 other machines that suddenly meant nothing. Danielle was in pediatrics, 4 floors down, when her radio crackled with the code blue alert. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate whether she still had the authority to respond. Her feet moved on their own, muscle memory from 20 years of running toward the sound of death instead of away from it. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her sneakers slapping the concrete in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Stairwell fluorescents flickered overhead like strobes. The antiseptic smell grew sharper as she climbed, mixed now with something else, the metallic copper of blood, though none had spilled yet. Not yet. But it would. She could feel it the way animals sense a storm coming. The ICU doors burst open under her palms. The room was chaos pretending to be competence. The on-call resident stood frozen beside the ranger's bed, staring at the flat line running across the monitor like a white scar. His hands trembled at his sides. His mouth moved without sound. Behind him, a nursing assistant hyperventilated into cupped hands. I've never done a pericardiocentesis, the resident stammered. His voice cracked on the last syllable. Danielle shoved past him. Not hard. Not aggressive. Just a single shoulder check that moved him the way a ship cuts through water. She was already calling out orders in a voice that came from somewhere deeper than her throat, somewhere that remembered Marja and the school building and the sound of a child screaming under rubble. Somebody get me a 60 cubic centimeters syringe. 20 gauge needle. Ultrasound machine. Now. The room shifted. Recognition flickered across faces. This wasn't the nurse who took insults in break rooms. This was something else entirely. A young nurse with a nose ring grabbed the ultrasound probe. A tech moved like his feet didn't touch the ground, producing supplies before Danielle finished asking. That was training. That was the difference between people who followed orders and people who understood them. She ran the ultrasound transducer across the ranger's chest, just below the xiphoid process where the sternum ended. There, a massive dark pocket of fluid surrounding his heart, crushing it like a fist closing around a bird. 200 cc of blood at minimum. Maybe more. His heart was a silhouette drowning in its own chamber. 2 minutes of perfusion left. Maybe 3 if she was lucky and his physiology cooperated. Hand me the spinal needle. Her voice was steady as surgical steel. She didn't look at the fluid bag, didn't calculate odds, didn't waste a single neural pathway on doubt. Her hands angled the needle beneath the ribs, aiming for the left shoulder at exactly 45 degrees. The needle glided through skin, a whisper of resistance, through fascia, into the fluid pocket. She watched the ultrasound image as she worked. The needle tip entered the dark space where the ranger's heart was suffocating. Syringe. The plastic clicked into place. She pulled back on the plunger. Dark blood filled the barrel like smoke, like a prayer answered in negative. Blood meant the pressure was breaking. Blood meant she was winning the argument with time. The fluid drained in surges, 50 cc, 100, 150. She didn't count. Counting was for people who had the luxury of seconds. 200 cc exactly, and the monitor's flat line twitched. A single beat. Irregular. Chaotic. But a beat. Then another. Then a rhythm establishing itself like a rhythm relearning how to exist. The ranger gasped. His body convulsed once, airway reflexing around the ventilator tube. His eyes snapped open, not conscious, not aware, but alive. The monitor climbed, 60 beats per minute, then 70, then a steady 80 that sang like a hymn nobody believed in until it arrived. That was when Danielle noticed Hargrove standing in the doorway. Silhouetted. Motionless. She could see his hands hanging at his sides, his jaw working as though his mouth had forgotten how to be polite. His expression moved through 3 distinct phases, contempt, then comprehension, then something that looked disturbingly like fear. She locked eyes with him for exactly 2 seconds. That was enough. She looked away and began disposing of the needle into the biohazard container. Motion. Professionalism. The mask slipping back down because that's what soldiers do when the war is over. But that wasn't the worst part, not really. The worst part would come in darkness and cardboard boxes and the kind of institutional violence that only happens when you embarrass the wrong person. 6 in the morning, Hargrove's office. The compliance investigator sat beside him like a hyena with a briefcase. Hospital security waited outside the closed door. Danielle could hear their boots shifting against the linoleum tile, the leather of their utility belts creaking. She sat in the chair across from Hargrove's desk with her hands folded because moving them would mean trembling, and trembling would mean giving him the satisfaction. Her scrubs were still damp from the ICU. The smell of blood was under her fingernails. Nurse Ross, you performed an invasive procedure outside your scope of practice. Hargrove's voice had shifted registers. Not angry anymore. Clinical. Certain. The voice of a man who'd already won. In a unit where your badge access was restricted. Against my direct orders. He would have died in 4 minutes. She said it to the wall behind his head, not to Hargrove himself. Control. That was what they had in common. He understood she wouldn't beg, so he wouldn't bother asking her to. This would be bureaucratic. Efficient. A knife between the ribs delivered by memo. The investigator slid a folder across the mahogany desk. The leather was worn, expensive, the kind of furniture that announced money in the way only old money could. She didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. Your employment history prior to Oak Creek Memorial is unusual. The investigator was a woman with gray hair and eyes like a reptile. No verifiable nursing experience before 3 years ago. No references from any hospital systems. No state licensing records beyond that period. Danielle stopped. There was no answer that didn't break 20 years of federal law. No explanation that didn't end with all of them arrested. She closed her mouth. Hargrove smiled. The expression looked like something that belonged on a museum painting, a study in cruelty disguised as policy enforcement. You violated hospital protocol. You violated state nursing regulations. You've demonstrated competencies that military-trained personnel possess. And you've done all of this in direct contradiction to my explicit instructions. He nodded. Just a small movement of his head. Security. The door opened. 2 guards in khaki uniforms, the kind of men who'd spent 20 years looking for an excuse to enforce authority. Danielle understood their posture instantly, compliance background, maybe 4 years of law enforcement academy, no field experience. They weren't dangerous. They were just the mechanism. Like a bullet knowing its direction. She didn't stand until they approached. She didn't fight. She didn't even look at Hargrove again. That would have cost her something she still owned, and she wasn't going to spend it on him. The walk from his office through the hospital corridor felt like an execution attended by empty chairs. Her colleagues appeared in doorways, physicians, nurses, techs, and then looked away. The physics of institutional humiliation worked the same everywhere. Nobody wanted to be collateral damage. Her locker was in the break room. She opened it with hands that remembered how to be steady. The uniform she'd worn 3 years. The name badge with her photograph, 20 years younger, before she'd learned that smiling at cameras was a risk. And her jacket, the navy windbreaker with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, stitches barely visible, fabric worn soft by decades of hiding. She held the jacket for a moment. 20 years. Marja. A child pulled from rubble. A heart that stopped beating tonight and started again because she was the only one in the room who'd ever fixed something this broken. She placed it in the cardboard box on top of her stethoscope. The guard stood on either side of her like parentheses closing around a sentence nobody wanted to read. Through the break room window, she could see the ranger's sister trying to approach from the hallway. A guard raised his hand. She stopped. Danielle didn't acknowledge her. Acknowledgement would have been cruelty, saying goodbye to someone while you were being escorted out, saying I see you and you see me and neither of us can do a damn thing about it. Better to be a stranger. The main lobby at 9 in the morning was nearly empty. Sunlight came through the glass entrance in columns, full of dust and morning light that made everything look like it was happening inside a photograph. Danielle carried the box past the admissions desk. Past the coffee station where she'd bought exactly 247 cups of coffee over 3 years, paying cash so there'd be no receipt, no proof of existence outside work. Past the security turnstile where the guard who'd always nodded at her now looked at his phone screen instead. The automatic doors opened. They always opened. That was the thing about automatic doors, they opened for everyone, heroes and thieves and invisible people being escorted off hospital grounds. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, box in her hands, the Texas heat already climbing toward 90 degrees. In the distance, she could hear the rotor wash of a helicopter, probably airlift coming in, probably someone else's emergency. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before she could turn the key. The box on the passenger seat. The cardboard worn soft already, as though the box itself understood it was carrying something that had been too heavy to carry for too long. That afternoon, a VA hospital waiting room in southwest Houston. Fluorescent lights that buzzed like they had something important to say but never quite said it. The smell of 1,000 men who'd learned how to hurt in the ways that didn't show. Danielle sat in a plastic chair beside a teenage Marine with a prosthetic leg and a form in his hands that asked the same questions all the wrong ways. She had her own form. She had her own pen. Previous military service, yes and no. The box for no was checked in ink from 3 years ago. She held her pen over it, hovering. Around her, men she'd once treated in field hospitals outside Sanjin Valley sat with the same dread on their faces. A staff sergeant with third-degree burns on his left arm glanced at her scarred hands. She pulled her sleeves down. This was the bottom. This was the lowest point of any descent, sitting in a waiting room as a patient, among warriors she'd bled beside, unable to acknowledge a single one of them because acknowledging them would require explaining why she'd become invisible. The intake nurse called her name. She stood. She walked to the window. She lied on the form the way she'd been trained to lie, filling in boxes with information that meant nothing and committed everything to silence. Noon the next day, the Oak Creek Memorial main entrance. A 17-year-old boy in a hoodie with a backpack that clinked as he moved, running. His name was Marcus and he was moving the way people move when they've just figured out the ending of a story everyone said had no ending. He sprinted past reception. A guard moved to intercept. Marcus didn't stop. "Mom, they need to see these." His voice cracked on the last word. He ran into the administrator's conference room where Hargrove sat with the hospital board, 6 faces around a mahogany table that had made 1,000 decisions about who mattered and who didn't. He dumped everything onto the table. Silver star. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. And underneath, sliding free from the velvet case, a faded unit patch, MARSOC Combat Support Team, Marja 2004. Embroidered edges. Worn soft by decades. The Ranger's sister stood. She was a nurse too, an RN with the Naval Nurse Corps, and she recognized the patch before she understood what she was seeing. Her hands moved toward it like a magnet pulling metal. She picked it up and the room went so quiet you could hear the rainfall that had started outside, hammering the hospital windows like the world was asking to be let in. This patch. Her voice was a whisper that somehow carried everywhere. MARSOC CST, Marja 2004. This is the combat support team that saved my brother. She looked at Danielle, who stood in the doorway, and then she understood. Recognition moved across her face like a storm crossing open water. "You're the medic from the school." The hospital board chairman stood at the administrator's desk with his reading glasses perched on his nose, a stack of declassified documents spread before him like evidence at trial. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth to explain, to spin, to deflect, to activate one of the dozen favor chains he'd spent 15 years building. The chairman raised one hand. Just one. A gesture so small it contained an entire career's worth of finality. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The words hung in the sterile air like a verdict. Hargrove's face cycled through colors, red, then white, then the gray of a man watching his foundation crack. He tried to speak. The chairman's eyes didn't leave the documents. "Security. Escort Dr. Hargrove from the building." 2 guards appeared, the same 2 who'd walked Danielle out with her belongings in a cardboard box 48 hours earlier. There was a symmetry to it. A reckoning written in shoe leather and procedure. Hargrove's mouth moved silently as they flanked him. The guards didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Authority moves like that, not through force, but through inevitability. The lobby doors opened to a constellation of news cameras. Marcus had made the calls. Local Houston affiliates, freelancers, a photographer from the Chronicle. Lights bloomed like flash photography at a crime scene. Reporters stepped forward, their voices layering over each other in that particular chaos of breaking news. "Dr. Hargrove, did you fire a decorated war hero? Did you know about her military service when you terminated her? How long have you been aware of her security clearance?" He tried to shield his face with the cardboard box, ironic, pathetic, but the cameras caught every frame. His eyes wide. His mouth open. The precise moment when a man realizes his network is worthless. A resident pulled out her phone and recorded. 3 nurses stood at the ICU windows, silhouettes against glass, watching without expression. One of them was Danielle, though she didn't watch for long. She'd already seen enough. The image would define him, not the credentials, not the board connections, not the years of careful networking. Just this, a man in a hospital-issued polo shirt, being escorted toward the parking lot by security, his cardboard box under his arm like a businessman from a 1980s recession photograph. Within 48 hours, Hargrove's professional network imploded with the speed of a controlled demolition. The board chairman, his yacht club contact, his entry point into institutional power, stopped returning calls. Medical colleagues who'd owed him favors suddenly had scheduling conflicts. His consulting contracts with military hospitals in San Diego, D.C., and Seattle evaporated when the story broke across medical journals and news wires. Chief of Staff terminates Navy SEAL medic, violates federal security clearance protocols. The Texas Medical Board opened an investigation into his treatment of Danielle, his falsification of complaints, his weaponization of policy against a protected veteran. His wife, who tolerated the long hours and the consulting trips, packed a suitcase and took their daughter to her mother's house in Austin. She left a note on the kitchen counter. He found it after a shift at Houston Community College teaching CPR to phlebotomists and nursing assistants. The note was short. Professional. Like a termination letter written by someone who'd already moved on. 6 months dissolved into the kind of quiet anonymity that men like Hargrove feared more than scandal. A colleague from his days at a surgical conference spotted him in a fluorescent-lit classroom at Houston Community College, wearing a polo shirt with the college logo embroidered over his heart. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths, 30 compressions again. The rhythm of salvation reduced to floor-level certification instruction. $18 an hour. His voice had lost its authority. It was just a voice now, explaining procedures to students who'd never heard of Dr. Hargrove, who had no idea they were learning from a man who'd once controlled an entire medical institution. When a former resident walked past the open classroom door, someone who'd trembled during rounds under his scrutiny, he looked up. Their eyes met for a split second across 12 feet of hallway. She kept walking. He looked away first, unable to hold her gaze. His hands trembled on the plastic chest. Not from fear. From understanding. The dummy beneath his palms had a stronger heartbeat than his career now. But the real reckoning happened in silence, in the spaces where power used to live. The revolving doors of Oak Creek Memorial pushed open and Danielle Ross walked back through them at 2,100 hours on a Tuesday, her name on the staff roster where it had always belonged. Full reinstatement. Back pay. A formal apology from the hospital board, printed on letterhead, written with the careful language of liability avoidance. She didn't care about the letter. She cared about the ICU. She cared about the night shift under the hum of those fluorescent lights that had become her cathedral. Her jacket hung open as she clipped her badge to her scrubs, new badge, her rank no longer hidden in the system. The faded unit patch remained sewn inside the jacket lining where it had always belonged, a ghost of identity that needed no announcement now. The truth had torn the doors off every cupboard where she'd hidden. She didn't mind anymore. The weight of secrecy was heavier than the weight of visibility. The ranger's sister was waiting by his bed when Danielle entered the ICU. Her brother stood beside her, wearing his dress uniform for the first time since the breakdown that had brought him to Oak Creek Memorial mute and shattered. His eyes, those same terrified eyes from the collapsed school building in Marja, 20 years and a continent away, found Danielle's across the room. Something shifted in his face. Recognition. Not just visual, but cellular. Memory traveling through neural pathways that trauma had supposedly severed. "You carried me," he said, his voice rough from disuse, each word a physical labor. "I remember your voice. You told me I was safe." Danielle's throat tightened. She didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of the machines that beeped their steady reassurance. But her hands moved to his shoulders, and she held him while his sister watched and understood that some bonds transcend time and silence and everything the world does to break us. The ranger raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Danielle returned it, her palm flat against her forehead, tears finally allowed to stream down her face now that the battle was over. Other veterans in the hospital, patients in beds, visitors in the waiting area, a maintenance worker in the hallway, stopped and saluted without knowing who they honored, knowing only that honor was being witnessed and it demanded acknowledgement. That evening, Danielle sat at the nurse's station under the same fluorescent lights that had watched her humiliation and her redemption. Her colleagues no longer avoided her in the break room. A resident, the same one who'd frozen during the code, who'd watched her hands move with the precision of someone who'd sewn wounds on operating tables under fire, approached nervously. "Can I ask you something about field trauma?" he said. Danielle looked up from her charting. "Of course." As she began to teach, explaining the difference between civilian triage and combat casualty care, explaining how pain was information and information was survival, a junior nurse listened with the intensity of someone being handed a secret. Marcus arrived with dinner from the Thai place near his university apartment, pad Thai, spring rolls, the kind of ordinary love that rebuilds lives. He hugged his mother in front of everyone, not caring that colleagues watched. The board chairman personally thanked her, his posture deferential now, offering a promotion to Director of Trauma Services that Danielle politely declined. "I just want my night shift back," she said. "That's what I want." The final image was quiet, the way true victories often are. Danielle alone in the ICU at 0200 hours, the hospital silent except for the metronome of monitors. She checked the ranger's vitals, oxygen saturation 98%, heart rate 72, regular sinus rhythm, blood pressure stable. Healing. The machine under his ribs, the one that would have stopped beating if she'd followed protocol instead of instinct, continued its faithful labor. She touched the unit patch inside her jacket lining one more time, her fingers finding the stitching in the darkness. Then she closed her jacket. A junior nurse approached nervously, hesitant, carrying a question about emergency procedures. Danielle smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in months, not a composition of restraint but an actual opening of her face. "Of course," she said. "Let me show you." As she began to teach, her voice dropped into that deeper register, the one that came from somewhere beyond civilian nursing, beyond the polite hierarchy of hospitals. The voice of someone who'd saved lives in rubble and darkness, who carried the weight of invisible children on her shoulders, who understood that mercy was a skill that could be taught. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And Danielle had always known how to work in the dark. Subscribe to see what happens when the world finally knows a hero's name. Like this story if you believe the quietest people deserve to be remembered. Comment, what would you have done in Danielle's position?